Hello you guys, welcome back to another tutorial in Rachel Parker's watercolor workshop. And in this tutorial we're going to do a beginner's tutorial. I designed this tutorial to be really good for beginners, and so I was careful to really provide some details that I might not provide to some of my more advanced students. So I hope you guys get a lot of tips out of this. And this painting took me on quite a journey. I am an animal artist. I am not a landscape artist, but I do acknowledge that landscapes can teach us lessons that maybe animal portraits do not. And one of those things is how to do a gradiated wash, which is required in this painting. And I think that's just a basic water skill everybody needs. And it's a really good basics tutorial watercolor lesson. And a good way to practice those is to paint skies. And skies can also teach us how to use the wetness of our paper and the wetness in our brush, and to get those ratios right, and how different ratios of water to paint affect how the paint looks when it dries. So I did this tutorial for that reason, so that you guys can practice getting different textures with different amounts of water in your brush and on your paper. And I encourage you to look at this tutorial as just for fun and experimental, and don't think in terms of making a serious painting out of it. I certainly didn't, and I tried this painting many times. So this is probably my favorite outcome. I really like the clouds, and I tried this one in an oblong format. So I just tried a lot of different things. Here, my clouds were painted on drier paper. Here, my clouds were painted on really wet paper. And so I played with this too and just experimented, and also with the end goal for me being to create a tutorial where I could really give you guys the tools you need to go on your own little journey with this painting, and have the tools you need to fix things as they happened with this painting, whether it be sopping up paper, letting it dry, painting over it to make it darker, whatever you might need to know as a beginner to make this a as successful painting as possible. But don't even look at it as a success versus failure. Look at this process for this particular painting as fun, experimental. Just try different things, and I would highly encourage you to paint this several different times like I did. I mean, these aren't even all of them. Look, you guys, I have more. So just have fun and play with it. So let's get started. I am working on taping this next painting down for you guys, and since this is a super beginners video, I thought I would show you some of the things that I work with. This is my 3M medical tape. This is something new I'm trying, and this is the first painting I've ever used this completely, so this is experimental. And this is medical, I think surgical tape, and I will put a link to it in this tutorial. But I'm trying it. Someone on one of my groups on Facebook said that this worked like a charm for them, and I've been having trouble with my tape sticking very well to my backing boards. And by the way, the backing boards that I've been using are by Elmer's, as in the brand that makes the glue, and they're Elmer's foam boards, and I will put a link to those as well. And you can get them in all different sizes. I believe this is an 11 by 14 size. And for this painting, I'm working on Arches cold press 140-pound paper, and I highly recommend that you use good quality paper for this tutorial, because for some of the blending and transitions in colors and darkness and lightness in it, you're going to need good paper. So I am painting this in a 5x6 format. I'm going to upload 2 different sizes of the tracing, and of course you guys can change the size of the tracing too with your own software program, whatever you use, but I will upload a 5x6 size and a more frameable 8x10 size if you think this is something that you will want to frame. So I'm working in a smaller format just to keep it simpler and easier to keep the water wet and keep everything in control. So I'm choosing to use the smaller size, but you can use the 8x10 tracing, or you can even make it an 11x14 and have a lot of fun with it. So I'm going to tape this down to my backing board now with my medical tape. and it tears really easily. And in my last painting that I used this, it did seem to be working quite well. So I was quite pleased with that. We'll see how it works when I use it on all four sides in the other painting. And that's in the clouded leopard tutorial, I do believe, where I used it just on one side because I had just gotten it in the mail and I had already taped my painting down, but I wanted to try it out, so I used it on one side of the painting and it seemed to work great. So now I'm going to go into full tape mode with it, and be sure to burnish it down, especially right here along the edge. So you really push down and make sure you've got it stuck to your paper well. And that way you will have less leakage. And I want the land, this is the dark land area, to be less, so I'm going to put my tape up higher. I don't really care about the dimensions that I'm painting because I'm not going to frame this, so I don't have to be careful about getting the tape right at the 8 by 10 marks, but you might want to be more careful if you think you might want to frame this. And I'm just going to burnish, burnish, burnish. Make sure I burnish all those edges nice and tight. Okay. That rolls up really easy. So anyway, all right. So there we've got our first little project in this painting done. We got it all taped. Okay, so I'm trying to decide what colors I'll use. So I think these are probably the ones that I will choose to work with. And I'll tell you a little bit about each one I'm using and why. Now, as you guys know, I like to use non-staining or less staining colors. But for this painting, I don't see me needing to do any scrubbing, really. So that might be less important, but still I'm just going to use the colors that I have, obviously. So the one color that I will probably use is indigo, and indigo is what you call a convenience mix, which means it is made with several pigments. And as you can see, the pigment here, well, you can't see because I write it so darn small, but it includes carbon black, which I believe is lamp black, PV19, copper phthalocyanine. So this has a phthalo paint in it. And phthalos are very staining and very strong, and that's probably why this is so beautiful and covers so well. And again, it's a convenience mix. It's Winsor & Newton indigo. So that's that color. And that's why I'm choosing it, because those dark blue clouds, I think they just look exactly like indigo looks. This is one of my favorite paints. I'm trying to find a good replacement for it. This is Antique Turquoise by Holbein Iroquois Paints, and they're discontinuing this color. And as far as I know, this is the only watercolor paint on the market that is made with, I believe it's PV19. The writing on these is so small, I'd have to look it up. But the pigment that is used in this is, okay, yeah, it's PB17. That pigment is not used in any other brand that I can find. If you guys find any watercolor paint made with PB17, it doesn't matter if it's called turquoise in the paint manufacturer's paint name. I'm talking about the actual pigment used, which is PB17. It's kind of like Latin names of animals. Latin names of animals are the same across the world, across whatever, but the actual given name of the animal might be different, and that's the same with paint colors. The paint colors can be anything. Turquoise, this could have been called, I don't know, cyan or whatever, but the pigment name is the industry standard name that everyone uses. So that's a little information for you, maybe a little too much, but. And then I've got cobalt blue. This has some really delicate blues up in the top. So cobalt would be pretty for this. Cerulean would be fun, because cerulean, I might use cerulean too because of the granulation. It would just be so gorgeous to watch all these colors mixed together. So I might grab some cerulean, but this cobalt blue, this is by Holbein, and it's just granulates beautifully. It's a really lighter color than ultramarine blue, but it also granulates really pretty. Granulation meaning just that as it dries, the paint leaves like little flecky looking spots, texture in the mix that just add a layer of complexity to the wash as it dries, and it's beautiful. So that's what granulation is. It's almost like it looks like it has sediment in it or something. Okay, and then this is Holbein aureolin. Another note about aureolin is if you research aureolin and just research the word aureolin, you'll find that most aureolins are made with a pigment that is not light fast. However, Holbein aureolin is made with a pigment that is light fast, and I've recently done all this research, so I can't read that. PY 154 pigment. Whenever you're wondering about what pigment is in your paint, it's usually written in very small letters that you got to put your glasses on to read. But if you research the actual pigment, like on handprint, which is, by the way, I don't think handprint's been updated since 2004, so that's why it's even more important to research the actual pigment in the paint. And oh, that's nasty, but okay, that's just, anyway. You want to research the actual pigment in the paint and not the pigment name, because manufacturers change names. Other paint colors that are used that use the same pigment call it Hansa yellow, I believe, and the name of it doesn't matter. The big name doesn't matter, but the pigment name is what matters to research. Okay, then Naphthol Red by M. Graham. This is another pigment that very few paint manufacturers use. Apparently it's used in lipstick. It's a bright red, gorgeous, wonderful red, and handprint.com put me onto this paint. And apparently there's another paint brand that used to use this pigment color, but that one was not light fast. But this particular mixture by M. Graham with this pigment color is highly recommended by Handprint, and it is indeed gorgeous. It's my favorite red, but most reds on the market don't use the pigment that is in this particular paint by M. Graham Naphthol Red. So that's my favorite red. And then Winsor Violet. This is just a really beautiful color by Winsor & Newton, and it mixes well with a lot of different things, and it just adds a lot of character. I think for whatever reason, somehow purple, if you add a splash of it to a lot of different color combinations, it just adds so much to the painting. It just really adds a beautiful dimension. I don't know, I just love adding a little bit of purple to almost every painting. So I will do the same with this. And in the clouds in this reference photo, I do see a little bit of purple-ish color, so we'll use that too. So those are our colors. Again, I'm using Arches Cold Press 140 pound. It's important to use good paper, because otherwise on cheaper paper, you're not going to be able to get the depth. You won't be able to get your darks, mainly is what I've noticed. You aren't able to get as wide of a range of values on cheaper paper. So you do want to use good paper just so you can get a wide range of values. Cheaper paper, everything seems to dry a lot lighter on cheap paper. And so you just aren't going to get as dramatic, professional looking results. And it's almost like painting with a different, in a different medium when you don't use good paper. Good paper is more important than good paint. I always use professional paint, and these tubes, yes, this might have been like a $13 tube and it looks tiny, but this will last me, and you guys know how much I paint. This is me painting. This tube will last me a year. So $13 spread out over a year is not expensive. It's just expensive to get started, but then you don't have to buy anything again for a long time if you use your paints correctly. And like me, if you refuse to get rid of your paint on the palette, I could paint a whole painting with just this little bit of paint on my palette for the most part. So That's why I don't clean my palette off, because I don't like to waste paint. You can reuse that paint that dries on your palette. You just reactivate it with water. So I encourage you to do that. Look how red that naphtha red is. It's gorgeous. It's kind of a warm red, isn't it? And then my violet, I'm just putting a tiny little bit on here just for the demonstration of these colors. Now you don't have to use all these colors. You could just use cobalt blue, naphtha red, and aureolin and not use any other colors. I'm just using basically convenience mix and adding some other colors just to add interest, but you don't need all these colors. If you want to paint this just with cobalt blue, naphtha red, and yellow, you can totally get these. You can get a pretty good close result. The only thing is this indigo is going to be really dark, and you would need maybe an ultramarine blue instead of the cobalt so that you can get those darks, because cobalt won't mix up dark. You could use Winsor Violet. Winsor Violet will make a dark mix, but cobalt will not make a dark mix if you use that as your blue. So if you don't have these blues, that is fine. Use ultramarine blue instead. Use any bright red you have. Cadmium red would work. Alizarin crimson would work instead of this M-gram naphtha red. And if you don't have aureolin, by Holbein, you only want Holbein aureolin, you don't want any other color aureolin. You could use cadmium yellow, you could use quinacridone gold. Any other yellow you have is fine, as long as it's a pretty pure yellow that mixes well with others. So you don't have to use my exact colors. The more important thing will be to get your values right. Okay, so don't worry about that. And then what I would recommend is at least getting a little bit of paint mixed up first before you start the rest of your process. And you're going to need a mop brush for this, a large brush that covers a lot of territory, because we're going to get everything wet. Or you can just spray everything and then kind of spread all that water around with your brush. It doesn't matter how you get your paper wet, but we're going to get everything wet when we do our washes, because this is going to be mostly about how to do a gradiated wash, which means we do it all in one session where we get everything wet, and then we put in all the colors, all the main colors in the sunset, and then we'll let that completely dry and see what we need to do, finish the clouds, and then after that we'll put in the very darkest darks and the horse. By the way, if you don't want a horse as your silhouette, you can look online and get all kinds of different silhouettes. You could put a giraffe. I did a giraffe once that really worked well for a silhouette painting. You could put like a giraffe and a baobab tree, and then bam, you've got an African savanna scene instead of a horse out in a field with his rider. You could do any kind of silhouette that you want in this painting. And I've done one where it's just palm trees and the sunset. And so this is a really great basic composition for a lot of different design ideas that you can use with a lot of different silhouettes. And all you have to do is go online and search giraffe silhouette, and you'll find a ton. I found a ton of different horse silhouettes. I went and searched horse silhouette, and I found lots of different horses, but I'm actually using the original one that was taken by this photographer, Russ Cross, who has kindly agreed to let me use this picture. So thank you, Russ Cross. He takes a lot of great horse pictures, and I've known him for several years online. All right, so I'm just going to do a little bit of mixing first. Now, these are all moist colors that I put on this palette just to have a more simpler look for this tutorial. But if you're working from your palette with dried paints, then you'll need to scrub your paint more than you'll see me doing, because these are moist paints already. And I think I'm going to just leave this indigo just like this, because the only time I'm going to use the indigo is in those very dark clouds, kind of towards the end of this wash. After it's dried a little bit but still moist, I'll use the indigo. But I'm going to go ahead and add some water to my cobalt, which is such a pretty color, and I always forget to use it. And then I'm like, why did I forget to use that? Okay, so I'm just going to kind of activate these colors so they're kind of ready for me to use when I'm ready to pick them up. And I'm going to try to squeeze all that out before moving on. And then I'm going to activate my peacock blue. No, it's not peacock blue. That's what it used to be called. They also discontinued peacock blue, which was originally how I discovered this pigment. But look how pretty it is. And all the turquoises that I've found, that I've looked at, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos to see if there's anything out there that's kind of a more blue, and I just can't find. I kind of get overwhelmed because there's so many different paint colors, so I need to keep looking, but it's such a pretty color. That really brightens up any painting, and I hope I can find a good replacement. And then here's my beautiful, very strong, Winsor Violet. After I'm done with this painting, I'll put whatever leftover paint I have back in my bigger palette, and it can dry and meld with the rest of the paint, and then I won't waste it. I'm not into wasting paint. This is actually a lot of paint. This paint is probably enough for a month of painting. So I don't waste paint. I just don't. It is expensive, but like I said, if you use it wisely, it will last you a very long time. Now this I'm going to use for orange. It's just for mixing an orange. You don't need to buy orange. You can mix perfectly good oranges. So I'm going to go ahead and mix quite a bit so that it's kind of ready to go. That'll be a very bright, gorgeous orange. This is, again, Aureolin plus Naphthol Red. Holbein Aureolin. Don't get a different kind of Aureolin unless you really research the color of the pigment they used in the paint. Another note that I will say is when I'm working, I always keep my water next to my paint, so I'm not having to drip a wet brush over my painting and risk dripping paint and water onto my paper. So you always want to keep your water and your paint to the right. If you're right-handed, I suppose if you're left, you want everything over on the left so that you're not dripping across your painting as you mix colors and go from your water to your palette and palette to your water and vice versa. So that's why I always keep my water and my palette together so I'm not dripping across the painting as I paint. Okay, now there's different ways to do this. There is called a bead technique, which I never use because that requires you to kind of keep your painting at an angle. And the idea is that you paint a layer and it creates a bead of paint at the bottom of this. And then you go in with your brush and pick up the next color or whatever you want your next stroke to be, and you just draw the bead down and you keep painting down. But I always paint flat, so I'm not going to do it that way, but maybe we should practice that too. So we'll practice that in a minute, but I want to do it my way first, and then I'll show you the bead technique if you're interested. And I did just buy a wooden palette so I can paint with the bead technique. So I'm going to get my whole paper wet. And I'm going to use quite a bit of water for the first wash. And then I'm going to wring out my brush. And then I just kind of wipe over my paper with my mop brush to kind of spread the water around evenly, because this is all going to need pretty much an even wash. Okay, and then just remember, whenever you're working on a wet piece of paper, you don't want to go back into the wet piece of paper with more water on your brush than what is on the paper because it will cause a cauliflower. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, when you're doing a sky, cauliflowers actually can look kind of natural, like, oh, must be a cloud there. But let me get my image up. Now, this sky is interesting because it's kind of a darker cobalt blue and then kind of a lighter, it goes kind of more watery light as it merges into the orange. So we'll use more, in fact, let's put a little bit more water in the middle here where it kind of is going to go from darker up here to light to darker orange as it goes down. So I'll just make sure I have plenty of water in the middle, but not too much. You don't want it dripping. You just want it moist. And so far it looks like our surgical tape is holding up well, doesn't it? All right, so for the first wash, I'm going to put this mop brush down. This is my Alvaro casting net brush, and it holds so much water and paint that I feel like it wastes paint because I need to put so much paint in it for all the water that this brush holds. So I don't use it for painting with paint very often. I use my size 8 silver black velvet round, and if you have a bigger round like a size 10, or I'm not sure if they make a 12, but that would be really good. This is almost too small for this, and this one's too big, so I don't have the most perfect brush for this. So I'm just going to work with my size 8. That's what. All right, so I'm going to pick up a good bit of kind of thicker milk, almost cream consistency. I mean, I really want to get this. I'm just going to go ahead and get crazy. I'm just going to pick up all this cobalt that I have on my palette and just bam. Now, usually you don't want to use a pure blue in your sky because it looks a little bit too, just looks too much. So I'm going to put a little bit of green and yellow in there just to dull it down just a very tiny skosh. And I'm going to put some peacock blue in there just to add some color. Now that is bright. I'm going to clean out my brush and get mostly water. And now I have a little bit of paint in my brush still, but more water. And so I know that I really want this upper corner to be really pretty and somewhat darker, just because I just think that it's really pretty. Okay, I don't want it too much though. So that's an indigo I just added. And clean out my brush completely because now I'm going to transition the colors to more of a yellow color. I'm going to get all the water out of my brush because this is starting to pucker up. When you see your paper, at least the 140 pound, start to pucker up, you know that that means it's getting to the stage where if you put a drop of water on it, it will cauliflower, and we don't really want that, do we? So you got to be careful when your paper gets to this level of dryness, because that is kind of a message to you that it's gonna start puckering up. Okay, now I'm picking up some red, just a little bit of red. I went really bright with the red the first time I painted this, where I lost the footage. So it got too bright in my opinion, so I don't recommend doing that. And I'm getting the water out of my brush. I'm trying to be really careful. And I'm gonna mix some more. See, my palette's getting too messy. But I want to mix some orange here. And like I said, you want to make sure that you don't have more water in your brush than on the paper. So I'm just going to put some nice little orange streaks. I'm going to make it less red than I did the first time I painted it and make it more delicate. And this is going to be black down here, so it doesn't matter what you do down here. But that is so pretty. And then in some parts of the sky, it's really quite bright yellow. So I'm going to add some yellow to a little bit of my sky, but let most of it be pretty pastel. Now I'm going to get a little bit more red and just add a little bit. Just be delicate with the red. I learned from my first wash because it will get really strong looking. Okay, so the next step can either be to paint your clouds or paint the really dark bottom silhouette part. And it just depends on how wet your paper is. If your paper is still wet and it's at that perfectly damp stage where you can do the clouds and they'll kind of be soft, but also hold their shape, go ahead and do that. But if you, like me, my paper pretty much dried too much, and so I decided to go ahead and do the bottom silhouette part first. But it doesn't matter. You can do the clouds or the bottom silhouette part, and you just need perfectly dry paper for this part, because this part is going to have the hardest edges of the whole painting. And here I am getting a lot of cream consistency paint on my paper. In fact, I could have made my paint even thicker, and I will go in later to re-darken this silhouette here. When I painted it in other renditions of the same painting, I did this part a lot darker, so you can actually use a lot more cream consistency paint than I am. I'm kind of using thick milk consistency paint here, but you can go a lot darker for the silhouette, and then you don't have to do a second layer over it again to get it really dark later. And one of the things that I think is a really effective way to paint these grass shapes is to use the side of your brush and kind of use a dry brush technique and kind of flick it up over the top where the grasses meet the background, and that kind of gives you a grass texture. If you use the side of your brush, and again, the paper is completely dry and you've got thick cream consistency paint in your brush, you can use indigo, or you can mix ultramarine blue with lamp black, or ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, whatever mix you want to use for your dark black. I liked indigo. You might not have indigo though. Indigo is a convenience mix, and you can mix your own black. You can use just straight lamp black, or you can use your mix of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And here I'm going in to paint the horse silhouette, and I just kept my horse silhouette really simple. It's all one color, kind of a flat, dark color, dark indigo or black. Either way works. I'm using my silver black velvet size 8 round because it has a good tip, and I can get pretty good detail with that brush. You can use whatever brush you have in your arsenal that has a good enough tip to create the little ears and the little details for this horse. You might need a rigger for the smaller details if you don't have these silver black velvet brushes with a good tip, and then use a bigger brush for the rest of the body of the horse, whatever you want to use. And just a tip for a basic horse conformation: the top curve of the horse's neck is a pretty horse would have kind of a curve, so keep that in mind when you're painting your horse, if you want it to look like a nice, well-bred horse. I do have a video all about painting horses. I have 10 tips about how to paint horses, and I talk a lot about conformation in there, so that might help you in this stage of the painting to paint this horse. Now, if you don't want this to be a horse, you can make yours a giraffe or a rhinoceros or a cat or whatever you want it to be. You could put a tree with an owl in it, or any kind of silhouette, and there's tons of silhouettes to be had. If you search the internet, owl in a tree silhouette, horse silhouette, I found so many when I searched for horse silhouette. So you don't have to use my silhouette. You can go on the internet and find your own. All right, so I've got the horse and the land done, and here I am, and then I let it completely dry, so that's why I'm able to brush over my horse like this. I'm using my silver black velvet 3/4 oval brush because it's wide, so it's really good at putting bigger washes like this water that I'm putting. And because that paint is thick down there, painting clear water over it kind of picked up and reactivated that layer. So just be aware that if you paint your sky second, then when you paint clear water over your sky again, you might loosen up that dark layer that we just put in for the silhouette. And that's what happened to me, and I had to go back in and paint it really dark again later, which is not a big deal. Just blot whatever paint comes up that you don't like if it activates too much and kind of blurs out around the horse. That's what happened to me. So I just completely re-wet my paper, and then I'm going to let my paper sit. And I don't want my clouds to be too feathery, but my clouds in this attempt at this painting are going to come out more feathery than in the original reference photo. And I was okay with that. I mean, they look like clouds, but they did get more feathery than what's in the reference photo. And for me, I practiced these clouds several times. So what I learned from that practice is have a few big, bold clouds and just a very few little smaller, thin, wispy clouds to balance out the big, bold shapes. But big, bold shapes in the clouds for this particular painting they look better, in my opinion, than small, thin lines. See, like there's a thin line, but if you put too many of those that match, it won't look good. And when I first painted this, that's what I did, and it just didn't look good. So just keep that in mind. And I'm painting on fairly moist paper here, and I'm using very thick cream consistency, indigo blue, very thick. You can see me blotting off the water over there on my cloth over there to get extra water out, because I really need a lot of creamy paint. And so I'm picking up a lot of paint and I'm blotting my brush as needed to get the extra water out too. And then for subsequent clouds, you can see I changed the color a little bit for the next clouds down. In these clouds, I added a little bit more Windsor violet and added a little bit more water. So these clouds were a little lighter, and they also had a little bit different color. They were more purple. And that's another thing that will help you have a successful cloudscape, is to make each cloud a little bit different. Some are a little lighter, some are a little darker. That top cloud was really dark, and also in the reference photo, the clouds have different colors. And then over here in this bottom right corner, I had sprayed the tops of those grasses and it bloomed out too much in this painting. So here you can see me kind of painting over that and saying, oh, well, these are just some trees off in the distance, and keeping them really light and kind of a little bit more faded than the foreground's dark silhouette, just to give a little bit more texture. But also I'm suggesting some trees there in the background to kind of cover up my little oops, where I sprayed my silhouette when it was still too wet and it blossomed too much. So that's okay. In a painting like this, you can just paint over it and say, oh, well, I meant to do that. Those are actually trees in the distance, so why not? And then here I'm going in carefully to repaint over my silhouette again. Now, my paper is completely dry here. You do not want this to blossom out, feather out at all. You want these to be really sharp edges, so you want to wait until your paper is completely dry here, and then go in with really thick cream consistency, indigo blue or lamp black, or the mix of your choice, of course, for your really dark silhouette. And I repainted right over that silhouette, because as you guys remember, I kind of reactivated mine and it lost its darkness when I painted over this area with clear water when I was preparing my paper to paint the clouds. And I'm just painting really carefully and trying to get this as detailed and correct as possible. All right, and then you're going to see me darken that right corner too with the side of my brush, doing some dry brush to darken that up. All right, I went and used a hairdryer on this just to move this along, because I have a quiet house right now and I need to maximize my quiet house time. So I used a hairdryer, and this is that medical tape. So let's see how it did, because this got very wet. Let's see. Ooh, it did so well. You guys, this medical tape is my new tape. It is totally official, unless we find something bad here. But little dots do get under it, but that is a small price to pay for a tape that actually sticks both to the paper and to my backing board. The problem with my masking tape is, well, really, it didn't stick to anything very well at all. So, oh, it's only a matter of time before I knock my water off this little desk. But anyway, yeah. Like I was saying, this medical tape, I love it, you guys. I really love it. It works very well with Arches cold pressed 140 pound. Now, if you're using a different paper, it might not. And some people were reporting that it tore their paper. So they probably weren't using Arches cold pressed paper. But I am, and look at that. Everything's clean. It got a little bit of stickiness there, but it rubs right off for the most part. Let's sign it. I'm going to use my Signo Uniball Broad. I was like, I hate it. So I painted this on the back. And do you guys see how the paint kind of lays differently on this side of the paper? This is the back side of Arches cold press 140 pounds, which is also an interesting thing to look at. It's rougher, there's more texture, and you can still get good painting on this side of the paper though. So just note to self, which I've forgotten until recently, you can paint on the back of this paper. And this is one of my favorites, and I painted it really quickly and spontaneously because I was frustrated with this one. So that's that. And then I think this was my next one. And the reason why I don't like this one, well, it's not that I don't like it, it just didn't work the way I wanted it to, because I mixed indigo and Winsor violet together, and look what it did. It has this weird little light outline around the indigo. They separated out really weirdly, like the dark of the indigo stayed in the middle of the puddle, and then there's a ring of light color, of light Winsor violet on the edges that kind of it just doesn't look like a natural cloud. It's an interesting effect, and maybe you could use it on something else. It like puts a halo around the cloud, and that was not working for me, but it was interesting. All right, you guys, I could go on and on about all the different little things that I learned on my particular journey with this painting, but you will have your own journey, and your painting or paintings will have their own personalities and journeys, and I hope I gave you the tools that you need to create the painting that you want to create with this concept. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I certainly enjoyed this process, and I will see you in the next tutorial. Bye, you guys.